Kamal, it's Nigel Farage's big day, his first Reform Party conference since the election. It's a staging post for him to launch his assault on the Conservatives and the country, because let's not forget, he said that he wanted to be Prime Minister come 2029. But will it work?
And I don't think it's a coincidence, Camilla, that just on the day of Nigel Farage giving this big speech, Robert Jenrick, the Tory party leadership hopeful, has blasted back in the pages of the Daily Mail with a very strong article saying that our identity is under threat because the metropolitan establishment aren't proud of being English.
I can smell some red meat roasting on the righty barbecue. And speaking of righties, we're also going to be hearing from Stephen Harper. He's the man who led the Conservative revolution in Canada, much admired by Nigel Farage. But is the feeling mutual? And does he think the MP for Clacton is a necessary part of the attempt in the UK to unite the right?
Welcome to the Daily Tea with me, Kamal Ahmed.
And me, Camilla Tominey.
Now, Camilla, just for our wonderful listeners and viewers, you're in your rather lovely house today. I hope Jacob Rees-Mogg is aware that you're working from home and being productive, of course.
Yes. I did seek his permission, explaining that I was writing my column today. I've got my husband away, so I'm flying solo in the childcare stakes. It's all hands on deck because we've also got the prospect of the Labour Party conference this weekend, which we're travelling to Liverpool for. So timetable difficulties have had to be contended with in Tominey Towers over the course of the last few days, but we're trying to win. And I'm trying to write this column, which at the moment is flowing like treacle through a straw. And it's meant to be about Labour and why the country doesn't seem to have much confidence in Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves. Hopefully I shall have that tied up after we finish this podcast.
Well, I'm really looking forward to reading that. I'm very much enjoying seeing your beautiful home in the Hertfordshire countryside. And also, of course, as you say, Camilla, we will be really dissecting Labour next week. Both of us will be there from Monday and Tuesday to really bring you all the latest details of what is often the latest disaster to befall us under the leadership of Sir Keir Starmer. But that's for another day, Camilla, because today is Nigel Farage's big day. I've been watching the Reform conference, which is at the Birmingham NEC, all morning on their live stream on YouTube. And I must admit, there's a lot of energy. They've got up to 4,000 people. It will be interesting, won't it, Camilla? The Conservatives are going to be at the same venue next week. So the week after Labour is the Conservatives. Will they pack out those halls in the way that Reform clearly has? Their membership has grown to 65,000. They're claiming they are the fastest growing party, not just at the moment, which is understandable given their great success over the past few months and during the election, but ever. I'm not sure that's quite true, but in any case, They are certainly growing incredibly rapidly. And there's a real buzz about their first big moment after the election successes that they had.
Yeah, it's interesting as well, isn't it, to see them at a major venue like the NEC in Birmingham. In the past, Reform conferences were sort of barely taking place at all. And if they were, it was in a couple of pubs somewhere. You know, it was completely below radar, not very official, and certainly not very professionalized. This decision in the last few days to change the ownership so that it becomes an entity rather than kind of Nigel Farage's own backed party, I think is interesting. The new CEO, Zia Youssef, is a very professional businessman. He's been extremely successful in his commercial life, though that adds a bit of seriousness to proceedings. Having said that, Kamal, they're doing the conference by day, and then the event tonight is meant to be the biggest, well, somebody's described it, excuse my language, as the biggest piss up in politics of recent decades. So goodness knows what's going to happen there as we see Farage, no doubt, propping up the bar with a couple of gin and tonics in each hand. Whether Priti Patel turns up remains to be seen. She quite likes partying with Nigel Farage. We'll wait for party conference season to continue in earnest for that. But also interesting to see who's contributed. I mean, Anne Widdecombe, Kamal, you'll have fond memories of her Tory output.
I have fond memories of her on Strictly Come Dancing. They're probably slightly more fond. But yes, Anne Widdecombe, of course, a very big figure in the Conservative Party in the 80s and 90s and became something of a bête noire for the left. But actually, had some very strong things to say and was a bit of ahead of the curve with this idea that the Conservatives needed to rediscover something about understanding the frustrations of groups of people who felt left behind.
Yes. If you can hear anything in the background, you can't really make up the timing, but the window cleaners have arrived. So they're just cleaning the windows now. I do apologise if they're background noise. This is the perils of working from home. Also, to get Ant Middleton, the SAS man, to appear at conference is a bit of a coup. He's got a massive social media following. I mean, that's quite the celebrity endorsement, isn't it? Do we think we're going to have any celebrities at Labour or the Conservatives?
I'm sure we'll have a number of celebrities at Labour. I would have thought they're going to want business leaders to turn up at Labour because, as you're suggesting, I think in your column from what you said a little earlier, there is certainly a great deal of worry amongst amongst businesses about Labour. So I'm sure they'll be looking more for that than the sort of lovey brigade. But yes, having Ant Middleton there is a social media coup for reform. Of course, he has his own controversies. He was incredibly aggressive about the Black Lives Matters demonstrations. Him and Channel 4, he was on SAS Who Dares Wins on the Channel 4, and they parted company. So he has had some controversial moments in his career, but as you say, he's got a big name and a big following. Well, Nigel Farage has just finished speaking. We're going to pick out two chunks of his speech at Birmingham. The first of them is about the party growing up from toddler to adult.
Because we don't want extremists. We don't want bigots. We don't want people who think that way, because we represent the silent, decent majority of this great country that we live in.
Nigel Farage also gave an indication of the kind of Britain he wanted to see.
And all that is, it's just the first big step on what I now believe, if you're with me, if you support me, if you're prepared to help me, well, then it will become the first big step on what I believe can be a truly astonishing, historic journey that can do something to do our country good, to honour those that have gone before us, and to give our children and grandchildren a better future.
Well, Camilla, just dabbing away the tears there. That was some ending to a pretty lengthy speech. What's your take?
I mean, Kamal, it's emotional. To be fair to Nigel Farage, he is a very, very, very good speaker.
Definitely.
You know how sometimes you watch politicians speak and then within 5 minutes you're sort of nodding off slightly, wondering when will this end? He's got a very compelling delivery. He certainly is comfortable working a crowd. I think a sketch writer once described him as a sort of maitre d' figure who likes to work the room. And I think we saw that today. Look, he's on very safe territory because he's got a load of fangirls and boys there. I thought he actually spoke convincingly about his desire to professionalise reform, talking about changing it and giving it back to the hands of the members, having made it a limited company initially because of the immediacy of the whole act of him becoming leader and then standing for Clacton. We've heard that rhetoric before. You know, he's talked before about why he decided to come back and that he thinks Britain is broken. And in a way, it's interesting because we're going to be speaking about Robert Jenrick's opinion piece in the Daily Mail, and he's kind of like striking some of the same notes, which is interesting from Farage's perspective as well as Jenrick's. This idea of trying to repair a sense of Britishness, to bring communities back together. He talks about faith and family as well, which has perhaps been a bit lesser spotted in Conservative circles in recent years. So I thought that was interesting. There's clearly a huge amount of ambition there. I mean, he admitted that most people think that he is joking when he says he's got ambitions to be the next prime minister. And we even had Zia Youssef, the CEO, speaking about this idea of Prime Minister Nigel Farage standing outside Downing Street in 4 to 5 years' time. I mean, is that at all credible, Kamal? What's your reaction to that? Because if they can gain some serious momentum, but my goodness, that vote share, it's at the moment 14. It needs to start with a 3, and that would mean doubling the amount of support that Reform has and then some.
Look, watching it, Camilla, I agree with a lot of that. The power of what he says, he has got a narrative. It is certainly compelling. I thought it was important that he tackled, well, 2 issues. The amateurism isn't such a big deal for me because that will come with time. But he went back again and again, and we heard it in our clips that we've just played. We haven't got room for a few extremists. We don't want bigots. This is all about the silent, decent majority of people who sort of play by British values. And I think, interestingly, on the day, as you said, we're going to discuss Robert Jenrick's piece, which talks about English identity. Actually, Nigel Farage lent far more into that notion of decency than Robert Jenrick's piece. And actually, Farage went through each of the leaders and he mentioned each of the Tory candidates, and he mentioned Jenrick, not quite by name, but said, he's somebody who was of the establishment, obviously, as you've said many times, was a Remainer who's been on this journey, whether it's believable or not. And Farage made that point. Now, clearly, in our parliamentary system, going from a position of 5 seats to actually competing for to win a general election seems, for someone maybe particularly like me who's been covering elections since 1992, almost ridiculous. But frankly, what Reform has achieved in this election from an almost standing start is remarkable. And who's he up against? I think the key thing will be Labour is going to really struggle with what it is we've done. We've done a lot on Labour and the poor, way that they've started this new government. The big issue will be, what do the Conservatives do and who do they vote in place? And I think that the one that would most, the leader that would most get in Nigel Farage's way would be Kemi Badenoch. I think that her tone and her obvious, genuine belief in the values she speaks about will talk much more to the heart of the type of people who vote right, of whatever persuasion, than some of the other leadership contenders. So I think it really matters what the Conservatives do. But I don't think, I must admit, Camilla, if you had asked me that question 6 weeks before the election, or, I would have been in the much more sceptical camp. But you see the enthusiasm there. You also look at the data, lots and lots of the seats are marginal. Without any backing, lots and lots of Reform candidates did remarkably well, and they sit second in tens of seats across the nation. Now, whether they can get a lift to being the party of government, I mean, it seems bizarre, but I think we are in change times at a time when possibly the 2 main parties are at their weakest.
Although I was watching it thinking, who else is watching this? Beyond your sort of Reform devotees and some interested Westminster wonks and us. He does need to have broader appeal, doesn't he, beyond his own fan base. Clearly, he has got this huge social media presence, and one can imagine that these clips are all going to be fired out with, great gusto over the course of the coming hours and days. I think it's quite clever positioning from him on 2 fronts with regard to just being so dismissive of the Tories. They're finished, the brand is busted, because that does present him as a viable alternative. And it is also clever politics. We've talked in the past, Kamal, about where does Farage go to broaden his fan base? If people regard him to be too extreme on the right, how does he kind of widen that tent to increase that vote share? He can't really go any further right because there's nowhere else for those further righties to go but him. So he has to go a bit more left of his own right. But he doesn't want to do that because he doesn't want to dilute or sanitize any of his policies, because he wants them to be robustly conservative with a small c. Having said that, that tactic, and they use this with the Brexit Party very much, he was insistent when they put the Brexit Party candidates together that they should be representative of a huge range of different people and be diverse and have people of colour involved and all the rest of it. So that offering to try and dampen down these claims of sort of bigotry and xenophobia, to say, look, we don't care what colour you are, we just want you to share our values, is actually quite clever and more inclusive than some of the language has been. I mean, that's quite an interesting way to pivot, because then that does open the tent a little bit more, I think.
And having Zia Youssef, who gave, again, a powerful speech just before him, it was interesting, the order. They didn't have Richard Tice and then Nigel Farage. They had Zia Youssef. They had Richard Tice, Zia Youssef, and then Nigel Farage. And I think that was, Farage did that deliberately. I mean, just to be clear, they have policies which are yet to be tested. There's an awful long journey for them to structure an organisation which he said should have the organisational power of the Liberal Democrats, who had a remarkable election, given that they actually polled fewer votes than Reform but won 72 seats. So he can see the model, which is the Liberal Democrat model. He will be now tested in the kind of heat of battle, and the next big stage for them is the local elections next May. Let's see how does he reach his hundreds of councillors target he has set himself. We'll need to see whether this is hubris. Of course, many people will just reject the Reform tone because the shadow of that bigotry, that xenophobia, the comments he has made in the past, his pro-Putin stances, that's a big shadow for him to get out of. Is this genuine? Does he do it year after year after year? Does he put in the really hard yards of work that is necessary to lead an opposition party? Or is he flying off to America every 5 minutes to see his chums around Donald Trump? Those are going to be the tests. But any party, Tory or Labour, that underestimates what Nigel Farage is doing and what Reform is doing are themselves idiots.
Yeah. One further observation. They need to get more women on board. I mean, it's very blokey, and it was observed during the election campaign that they didn't have that many female candidates standing, even though they stood candidates in almost all constituencies. It's all very well having Anne Widdecombe, but, they need to be presenting themselves as forward-facing, of looking to the future. So they need some young women involved, I would suggest. At the moment, this is the other criticism, it's all a bit nostalgic. It's a bit 1980s, sort of, Courvoisier drinking, a bit greed is good, back to Maggie's Thatcherite capitalist ways. And I think they need to be a bit more, this is going to be the buzzword, I feel, of this podcast, Kamal, because I know you're going to say it in reference perhaps to Stephen Harper, but they probably need to be a bit more progressive in regard to attracting younger people and females. So that would help.
Yeah, I think it's a big point. Look, let's hear from Dom Penner, our political correspondent, who's been at the Farage conference all day today, and he's going to really tell us about the mood on the conference floor. Well, just to remind people of their success on July the 4th, they won 14% of the vote. They gained 5 seats. And frankly, in the campaign, the announcement that Nigel Farage would be standing, that they had this full slate of candidates across the country, really did light up the debate, which frankly would have been pretty boring, or even more boring without them. Plenty of enthusiasm there from the conference floor. But how should the Conservatives respond? Well, Robert Jenrick, the Tory leadership hopeful, has been given his views. And also Stephen Harper, one of the most successful Conservative leaders from Canada, has also been in London giving some thoughts on Nigel Farage. Let's catch up on all that after this.
Welcome back. Well, Robert Jenrick, Kamal, looks as if he is now favourite to become the next Tory leader. He's got some stiff competition from Kemi Badenoch, Tom Tugendhat and James Cleverly. They'll all go to a beauty parade at the Tory party conference at the end of the month, where 4 will be narrowed down to 2. The members will vote and choose one. But it is interesting to see Jenrick flexing his right-wing muscles here. I say interesting because he has been on a journey, as you and I both know. He was once nicknamed Robert Generic, because he didn't seem to believe in much. Now he believes in, as we mentioned earlier, throwing red meat to the right. And he's done that in the Daily Mail with a column headlined, "The attitudes and policies of our metropolitan establishment," that's you, Kamal, by the way, "have weakened English identity.
Oh, sorry.
They have put the very idea of England at risk." So he's basically making this point that England's at risk, that we're all feeling like we are made to feel like racists and bigots if we're proud of England, that something has eroded in what it means to be English. It's all quite nostalgic. Most people in the UK are proud to be British, he declares. A nation should put its own citizens first, he adds. Are you suggesting that the country isn't at ease with itself? What do you think, Kamal?
Well, look, we know there has been lots of division. We've had the riots of summer. We've had big issues around cost of living and who does it affect. The whole reason for reform being such a powerful force and an important force, frankly, in British politics is because lots of people don't believe what are described as the mainstream political parties have done enough to really think about the different challenges that different groups face. And now with a Labour government, there is more concern for those people who don't believe that Keir Starmer is taking the country in the right direction, that therefore no one's looking after their interests. I think the key issue, though, for Robert Jenrick is, as you say, Camilla, is this genuine, or has he just put together a set of sound bites that sound good in a newspaper article, and that's an important part of communication. But as we've discussed so many times, what is the substance of what it is he is saying? And we're going to get on to Stephen Harper a little bit later, just after our discussion about this article. And you can see in Stephen Harper that there is a way of managing this idea that, do I need to copy or ape the language of reform to be successful on the right, or can I do it in a way that still allows me to pitch my tent over a big enough part of the electorate that I can still possibly win an election, while still be able to understand why is reform so successful? And I think Robert Jenrick's pitched himself to the right-hand side of that discussion, so is moving more towards, if we don't accommodate the reform language, we won't be successful. But when we come onto the Stephen Harper discussion, and this is much more where I am, there is actually, I know you will hate this word, Camilla, but Stephen Harper uses it. There is a progressive way to tackle, from the conservative side of the political debate, the issues that we are facing by taking immigration seriously, by ensuring that the proceeds of whatever growth there is more equitably shared, and by not patronizing people, by calling them racists, or they shouldn't be listened to, or they don't understand where the UK is going. One thing I just would say to Robert Jenrick is that if he is angling this type of attack on me, or maybe Camilla, you think he is, and I don't know whether he does, but I just think it could be quite nice to get away from this idea of metropolitan elites. I'm very proud of this country, but I'm also very proud that we can be a country which is very welcoming to all sorts of different people who contribute so much to this great country of ours. And I just think there is a way of making the argument from the right that doesn't have to just flex into these slightly darker forces, which I think you dabble in. You have to dabble in with great care, because they can quite easily become something which becomes unpleasant and nativist, whilst at no time should you be ignoring.
No, I mean, I only made that point because the word metropolitan is in there. Although maybe you do feel it, you may feel this more personally, because I know we've discussed on previous Daily Teas a sense of discomfort you find at times in the St. George's flag. And he's pointed out here that he thinks it's wrong that people actively disapprove of that red and white flag. He points out Emily Thornberry the Labour MP who mocked in a tweet in 2014 that house that had been adorned with 3 St George's flags above a white van parked in the driveway. He's saying that the metropolitan establishment have denigrated and mocked expressions of English identity. They seem happier celebrating other cultures instead, which I suppose may be aimed. It's certainly aimed at some aspects of Labour. It's aimed at people who have perhaps talked in the past about Britain's colonial history and talked about Britain in the context of the empire, and appeared to people like Robert Jenrick to sort of debase our history in some way or try and paint the British in an overwhelmingly negative light when perhaps that's not deserved. But on the flag point, what do you think of that? Not everybody has the same emotion about it.
Well, as I revealed yesterday, Camilla, I'm a proud white
Yes.
van man driver. I don't think I had St George's flags fluttering from my windows, but I can be that. And I think he's absolutely right that we shouldn't denigrate anyone for using the flag of St George or any of the flags of the Union. That's obviously fine. But also I am quite, within my rights to also feel uncomfortable because of the way it has also been misused by people on the right. And that's what I mean about, for Robert Jenrick, I think he needs to think about, is he just sort of playing this sort of bingo of these, phrases about denigrating the St George's flag? He's not. It doesn't go to any more depth. I suppose what I want to see from the next Conservative leader is someone who has some depth about these issues, whilst on the one hand understanding that for some people the St George's flag might be uncomfortable, whilst also understanding that I don't agree that you should denigrate, the white flag. And what Emily Thornberry did, was embarrassing for Emily Thornberry. And, we all make up this great United Kingdom, and we all have different opinions, and we all have this, I hope, British idea of tolerance and rubbing along and getting on with things as long as we're all contributing. And I suppose that's what I'm asking, is for a slightly more nuanced view of these issues. Because if you just do it in this is actual black and white, but if you just do it in a black and white way, you either love the flag with no concerns whatsoever, or you supposedly hate the flag.
No,
that's not where the public is. They don't live in that kind of world. They understand. I think they respect the attitudes of people like me, but they also are proud of England and where they're from.
I mean, also when you say
right.
about a lack of nuance, some of the statements he's making in this piece, for instance, legions of graduates are taught that England has a uniquely evil past that is responsible for the world's injustices. And I'm thinking to myself, well, some people think that. Has he just fallen into the trap of sort of taking the bait of the Churchill is racist brigade, which is actually a tiny minority of thinking in this country, and sort of then responded to it? Because I'm just looking at this idea. He's sort of saying English children learn little of our history. I've got 2 children studying history GCSE and then another one kind of coming up through school. Look, they all do the Second World War. They do Hitler, they do Churchill. I'm just saying, do you see what I'm saying here, Kamal? It's like, is he just falling into the trap of thinking, because there are very few, let's be honest, in this country, sort of people who are basically holding the British completely responsible for slavery, not acknowledging our role in ending it, suggesting that all Churchill was a racist, rather than actually making it clear that he was a war hero who may have been a man of his time. All of these kind of very fringy, extreme views, they're not mainstream, are they? I think we should call out this nonsense when we see it, but to make out as if everyone thinks like that, I think it's obviously playing to a crowd here, and I perfectly get that, but do most people think this stuff? Do most people denigrate the flag?
I don't think it's true, is it? As you say, you've got children at school. I've got children who are at university or have just finished university. That's not what they are taught. They're not taught that the United Kingdom was uniquely evil in its colonial history. They are taught that colonial history meant many, many different things, some of which were incredible and positive, and some of which were not. And that's perfectly possible to have that position. And some might say that Robert Jenrick, you're right, has taken the bait. I think sometimes it's described in the other direction as a useful idiot, someone who takes on an argument even though the argument isn't true. And I think that's the slight issue that he needs to consider, and certainly if he becomes leader of the Conservative Party, we're way off that yet, but that he needs to consider what is the message that he is sending so that he can build a coalition. And why don't we move into Stephen Harper's. He was an event for Policy Exchange today in London. He's the person who is credited with really reforming what was a disastrous conservative legacy in Canada. The progressive conservatives, it's very similar to the journey here, or has some similarities with the journey here. So the progressive conservatives were the party of government in Canada, but there were lots of allegations that it never understood that people's worries about migration in particular and inequality weren't being listened to, and it kept ploughing on. And Stephen Harper said ploughing on in a very similar way to President Macron in France, where they didn't reform enough. And then in the 1990s, this all came home to roost. They absolutely collapsed in the general election, and they only won 2 seats. And at that stage, Stephen Harper was leading a party called Reform. And Reform was seen as one of the reasons, similar to the election we've just had here, that the progressive conservatives in Canada did so badly. Stephen Harper then went on a journey which Nigel Farage, I think, would like to repeat. He then started, after Reform, a party called Canadian Alliance. And Canadian Alliance merged, frankly, a reverse takeover of the progressive conservatives. And then Stephen Harper actually resurrected the right and then became Prime Minister between 2006 and 2015. So his journey, I think, has got a lot of very important lessons for the Conservatives here. I listened to his speech this morning. Let's just take a little bit of it. I thought one of the most important parts to hear from him was what he said when asked directly by a young Conservative candidate who had lost her seat at the general election by something like 350 votes to Labour because the right-wing vote was split in her constituency. Now, forgive me, I didn't catch her name, but she asked a direct question of Stephen Harper: what should the Conservatives do now to ensure that those kind of losses are not happening at the time of the next election?
Look, that's a really good question, a really critical question, and my advice would really be this, and really an advice to a future Conservative leader. When you face a party to the right of you, you have to be very careful how you deal with it. Often what happens, and I'm not necessarily commenting on the last British election because I didn't follow it in detail, but often what happens is, egged on by the left-wing media, the tone of the traditional Conservative Party to a right-wing insurgent will become denunciatory, extremely denunciatory, and in the process actually alienate core Conservative voters.
So he talks through, Camilla. He says that don't denunciate reform. The worst thing you can do, which is what the progressive Conservatives tried to do in Canada, was attack reform. And he said that made it sound to the voters for reform that you were attacking them directly. But he then did say that unlike the progressive Conservatives in Canada, the Conservatives here are still the dominant parliamentary political force, whereas the progressive Conservatives were over in Canada. And he said that therefore the Conservatives are the vehicle for right-wing politics in Canada, and also that they don't have to deal with Nigel Farage because there is always the whiff of xenophobia and libertarianism, which are not always, well, xenophobia obviously is not a core value, but the Conservatives are not simply libertarian. They are market orientated, but traditional. And so he makes these 2 points that xenophobia and libertarianism are not as sort of prominent in the Conservative worldview as they are in Reform's worldview. So he's saying you don't need Nigel Farage, but you need to make sure that you're having strong immigration policies, et cetera, et cetera.
But then in that regard, then, if Stephen Harper is saying, look, you can keep Reform sidelined, because if you look at that vote share of 14%, we were sort of at peak Tory failure. We have a Labour government elected not through any great popularity of Keir Starmer or his cabinet, because they only won on the basis of a 34% vote share. So you could have said that the last general election was like the peak moment for Reform to really triumph. And I'm not taking anything away from their victory in coming second in a load of constituencies, certainly being responsible for unseating very many Tories, notwithstanding the lunacy perhaps of unseating Tories that supported Brexit and are very much on their side of the argument economically, socially and all the rest of it. You could say that that could have been their big moment, and it wasn't. And we have to ask ourselves why that is. And this quest by Nigel Farage to beat the Conservatives or become the next Prime Minister, I think is going to be difficult, because all the people that would ever have voted for him have. And I don't think him lurching any further to the right is going to attract any more, notwithstanding, again, you know, the rise of the AfD and other kind of parties like that in Germany and parts of Europe. So this is where I then disagree with you, Kamal, because you do then need quite a robust righty at the helm of the Conservative Party to provide the electorate with a kind of more rational, economically literate, based in experience, but low immigration and low tax focused sort of solid righty as Tory leader. And you've said in the past, oh, well, they can win from the centre. I think the centre has shifted so far to the left that we can barely see what it is anymore. When Ian Duncan Smith came on, I thought he identified something really crucial, which is there is no centre ground, only common ground. So if you did get a sort of common sense righty in the post of Conservative leader that wasn't having to go quite to the extremities of Nigel Farage and reformists, you know, we've had some reformists saying things about migrants drowning in the Channel, you know, if you strip away the kind of language that just makes even robustly Thatcherite right-wingers wince, which could be associated with Reform, and you just have a straight right-wing Conservative offering that sticks to its promises and, by the way, restores the party's reputation for economic competence in light of everything going on with Labour, and it's a perfect opportunity, then I think that Reform can be sidelined and that Harper is right. But I do disagree with this one nation, oh no, the Conservative Party will only beat Reform and Labour if they go further to the left. That doesn't make any sense at all to me.
I think you're right, Camilla. I remember we had this great discussion after I wrote about Nigel Farage pre the election, and I did drop the centrist thing because I think, Camilla, you've persuaded me. You know, you've persuaded me that there needs to be a much more what you describe as common values approach. I do get that. Do you think, Camilla, that Robert Jenrick, this idea that he's been on a journey, which you always say with a slightly arched eyebrow, i.e., are you quite convinced? I just wondered, are you convinced, given what you've just outlined about, you know, economic competency, patriotism, you know, being in the right place on immigration? Do you think that Robert Jenrick is genuine in where he's landing now?
I don't know, because I can't quite work the bloke out. And when we did all of the leadership interviews on the Daily Tea, he was more uncertain of himself than, say, Kemi Badenoch. The point I made about Kemi Badenoch afterwards to you, which I think you agreed with, is out of the four of them, the only one that didn't have to look up to their special advisor to answer a question was her. She is a woman of conviction. She absolutely believes what she says, and she hasn't really been on much of a journey. She was in the right place as far as the right's concerned on Brexit, on free markets and capitalism, on productivity, because she was an engineer and she made that a central part of her leadership pitch. It's just hard with Jenrick. I mean, he struggled with a couple of questions in the interviews I've done with him. First of all, well, you're now claiming to be a Eurosceptic and you were a Remainer, and now you're talking about leaving the ECHR, which seems completely counterintuitive to what you voted in 2016. And I also asked him, and he didn't have an answer for it, which tax would you cut first? And he was like, oh, like a rabbit in headlights. So the other thing is, you can write these articles. You know, Suella Braverman's done a good trade in writing these kind of articles, and part of it appeals. You can look at some of it and say, well, I am annoyed that the St. George's flag has been weaponised so much. I'm proud of being English. Why are we not allowed to be proud to be English, but yet nationalism is perfectly acceptable in Scotland? There's an unfairness about it. People might look at our educational establishments and say, oh God, most teachers and lecturers are really left-wing. You know, what are they teaching our children? If it's that Churchill's a racist rather than a war hero, then that troubles me. But we all have a dialogue about that, and we challenge that behaviour, and that's why the word woke has become a thing. And we've had, you know, people trying to rage against that sort of leftward drift. I don't know how helpful this sort of language is really. Also, who's he trying to appeal to? His electorate isn't Reform right now. He's got two different electorates. He's got Tory MPs and then he's got Tory members. Well, if they're still Tory members, that means that they believe in conservatism, not Farageism. Otherwise, they'd have voted him and abandoned the Tories.
I'm excited for, we're going to be at Tory Party conference the week after next. We're going to be live there. You also, Camilla, are going to be interviewing the Tory hopefuls. It's going to be a really interesting series of live podcasts. So, you know, we're going to really be able to get under the skin of which of these candidates could be the best for the right. So I'm really looking forward to that. Just say, having watched Stephen Harper today and watched his speech, I think his list is not a bad list to test against all four of the candidates. He does talk a little bit about positive change. They do use the word progressive in Canada much more on the right. And I think the right could look to, actually, let's just take that word back. Let's make ourselves the ones who can say we are about positive change. I think it can sometimes feel from the right is all about everything's a disaster. And they could maybe think about changing that. So positive change, market orientated, but not libertarian, because the Conservatives are not ideologues. They are pragmatic, and that's what they are like. That's what people like about them. What they don't like about the left is that it's ideological. And then he said patriotic, but not xenophobic and isolationist. He also said pro-European. I don't think he means European Union, but pro the structures of the West, like NATO, like the European Union to an extent, but certainly not pro-Russia or leaning in towards Russia. And of course, we know that Nigel Farage, one of the most controversial moments during the election campaign, were Farage's attitudes to Ukraine and to Russia and to Vladimir Putin. And then he said faith and family, but not theocratic. So again, saying that we think that faith and family are vital and are important values for the United or for conservatism, but not in an ideological sense, i.e. if you're not married, you're bad, or if you're not this faith, you're bad. And I just felt that mix of pragmatic, positive change, markets, patriotism, faith and family, I can start seeing, and this is where you've nudged me, Camilla, it's not about centrist, it is about what is a conservative set of values which can appeal to the widest number, including some people who might be coming back towards the Conservatives, having voted Labour or the Lib Dems by 2029.
But those, I agree with you, they are good buzzwords for any future leader to have at their disposal. And I agree with you that they're quite not just sensible and solidly conservative, but also quite inclusive. Again, sorry to bang on about it. And I think people start to think I'm Kemi Badenoch's fangirl. These were the values that she espoused. No,
I like her as well, Camilla. I think
but
she
these
was
were the
very
values
impressive.
that she
was very
espoused
impressive.
in her leadership pitch. So we had very blokey sort of security, trust, act, and kind of things from Cleverly and Tugendhat. I can't quite remember Jenrick's as clearly, but the only person who talked about being positive and having fun and let's make something of this was Kemi. And the only person who spoke convincingly about family was Kemi. And the only person who, I mean, to be fair, you can't accuse Tugendhat of not being patriotic because he had the Union flag, not Jack, all over his campaign literature. But again, we had that whole spiel from Kemi about what she feels about being Nigerian and British, which was quite compelling. So let's see what happens. I spoke to 2 former cabinet ministers. I was walking to a Greggs, I don't mind telling you, Kamal, last night on the way home, and I spotted 2 former cabinet ministers, very senior Tories, at the pub nearby. And I won't name who they were, but both of them seemed to think that Kemi will somehow be forced out and that it will be Jenrick versus Cleverly and that Jenrick will win. And then I had lunch with another very well-placed Tory insider who also said that even if Kemi was in the final 2, Jenrick would still win. So let's see.
It's going to be a fascinating couple of weeks and then into November when we'll actually get the full result.
We'll be back on Monday from the Labour Party conference in Liverpool.
And I know how excited you are, Camilla, for our little journey together up to Liverpool, where we'll be spending lots of time with lots of socialists.
Rubbing my hands with glee at the thought, Kamal. We'll be back again 5 p.m.